Hello again, I'm Greg. I want to thank you, first of all, for traveling with me through the course of modern hermeneutics. And now, simply a summary of the whole thing that we've been talking about for many, many episodes. I think there's been something like 30 plus episodes now. And this is the very end of this particular journey. So thank you once again. This, of course, is the perennial scope of hermeneutics. As long as language is the chief means of human communication, those doing the communicating will ever have to rely upon interpretation. There is for mortal consciousness no immediate meaning to anything, and beyond this, meaningfulness must be further created by each of us, living on in the face of both mine own most death, the comings and goings of others, and the worlding of an anonymous world. For modernity, the universe is both godless and finite, and enemy the common lot alike for those who think and those who simply do. Yet this is no desultory dirge, for it is this very condition that has brought hermeneutics, once, as we have seen, a rather obscure and narrow sensibility directed to sacred scripture and like hair-specs alone, to the very center of both human and historical life. For the past 3 centuries, we cannot do without interpretation, from the most casual of social encounters to the most arcane of philosophical or cosmological pursuits. Our shared challenge of the eventide is no longer the barbarian at the gates, against which we surely would still rely upon the proverbial wooden walls, but rather the cast of a human future, any future, and how that basic sense of looking ahead can be brought within the more essential ambit of Dasein's being ahead of itself. For interpretation is itself already oriented to something beyond the state of things in the present. I say to myself, I need to know something that I do not already know. In this is contained a temporal tension. What is of the present does not suffice for either my understanding of things or my self-understanding. In this, hermeneutics is never truly about the past at all. It gears itself into the present through accessing what is previous to itself, but its entire goal is oriented to the future, wherein I imagine I will have in my possession what I previously needed to fathom. And in this, interpretation shows the future that the present remains interested in it. We have seen that the 4 models of modern hermeneutics coincide with the 4 major types of interpretational object. 1, the romantic circle, which zeroes in on authorial intent, speaks to the text as a whole, once generalized outward from that deemed sacred. 2, the historical circle spirals its way toward the meaning for those the text or text analog had a time of origin, inception, or reception, and this was particularly well suited to the history of imagery. 3, the phenomenological circle sought to transcend both history and authorship, and in this it cleaves well to music, the human language which shows that our provinciality can still create that which overcomes it. And finally, 4, the dialogical circle seeks contemporary meaning in all 3 forms of world in which humanity simultaneously dwells, the social world, the life world, and the world itself. Each, by its own aspirations, contributes to a holism which elides away from meaning to our further stated goal, that of meaningfulness. But this elision is not a slippage in the usual sense. Meaning may be displaced, as we saw when we invoked Saussure in aid of explicating the structure of language in use over against the idea of the logos, but meanings in the plural persist. Is this a mimesis of the difference between anxiety and anxieties, or does language in fact come before the elemental constitution of Dasein? Phenomenology tends to answer in the negative to this second clause, but hermeneutics responds more positively. Interpretation is, in this sense, a living standard and version of the puzzle presented by the Enlightenment, and it is not a coincidence that its growth and development beginning in the early 19th century so closely succeeds the Kantian reworking of idealism in the face of empirical study. One could also see hermeneutics as a combination of these 2 seemingly polar discourses. It encounters its object, text, image, music, or yet world in a generally empirical manner. Foucault even speaks here of empiricities, Heidegger of existentials, and Merleau-Ponty of the chiasmic quanta that provide both a reference point as well as a perspectival moment, which then realigns our perception of both thing and name, amongst others. One wonders even if the subito, the suddenness found in Kierkegaard's writing about anxiety, represences itself in phenomenology proper just at this point. Surely, I might acknowledge that the reduction is itself a sudden thing. at least in its immediate effects. Whether we are seeking to downplay, docket, or place aside the raw sensate of life and world, or to engage more directly with it, we still clear a space for interpretation to begin. This is a conceit, of course, in the sense that meaning is already and always present. But here is a clue to what we have just noted above. Yes, I know what I am about in the present. But since this now is ever itself eliding within the fluxion of awareness, only recently measured and objectified with any specifically realistic acumen, what I do not yet know is what I will need to know in the next moment and thence the next. If phenomenology can both describe and analyze the how of time, the means of the present, and the conception of the future and past alike, I need an hermeneutics to explain to me why any or all of this matters, or indeed does not. In this, phenomenology is not truly an interpretation of things at all. It posits structure, force, even institution, as well as discourse, perception, and worldview. What hermeneutics adds to this, very much as a complement, while at the same time being its own patent presence, is that structure is itself an interpretation of consciousness, that consciousness is itself not only a social product, as Marx and Engels famously state, but that it is the result of interpretation, ongoing and alive to the world, resolute in its anxiety, ahead of itself, in its being present. The very conception of self-verstandness, self-understanding, which animates our seemingly contradictory condition, that I am at the least comprehending of my incomprehension, that I did not know all I needed to know, requires of us an honest gaze into the hermeneutic mirror. It can be a jolt to realize how naive we have been about this or that, but generally a lack of present experience can be taken in our stride. We know ahead of time that there will be times when we do not know ahead of time. The ludic aspect of this condition, even that it implies some self-ridicule, is also not lost on us. One might suggest that the very parts of inexperience, naivete, incompetence, or even being taken aback are what allows us to grasp hold of the errant in ourselves and regain our equilibrium in the face of both change and the idea of the future itself. All of this has both an immediacy and an empiricity about it. I am present in the wide-awake reality of majority consciousness, and this is my starting point. I accept the phenomenological constructs all about me, but I also desire to understand them more fully, as well as myself. I feel I am not only an object for others, and that consciousness is not only that which is embodied. I imagine that language is not only refracted logos, and that meaning is not just that which each and every one of us must cleave to as is. And all of these surmises, which have not yet been tested in any manner, are as well empirical, in the sense that I experience their effects. My Dasein, my being in the world, is in part conjured by anxiety and thrown in its encounter with the world, but alongside this, and resonating with it, are the anxieties and even anxiousness which I may experience in my ignorance of both world and future. Even so, this is the incipience of hermeneutics as a discursive entity and the nascence of interpretation as the modus vivendi thereof. I do not absolutely have to know anything more about myself by my own druthers alone. My ongoing life would be narrowed, certainly, and I might find that I have forgotten how to live at all. But the impetus to act upon what could be anomic, anxious, entangled, or simply an annoyance to me is found not in the empirical, but rather in the rational, thereby engaging the other major aspect of Enlightenment thought in itself. This is why modernist hermeneutics can be thought of as a response to the 18th century as a whole. It is not as radically critical thereof as the so-called anti-humanist thread of Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud, for instance, though especially for the last, hermeneutics regains its central place in this radicalizing discourse, and, for me, I think this to be its very authenticity. For to engage in interpretation at all at once declares that I am not content with the world as it is presented to me. It is more reasonable to look back upon the 19th century as the fulcrum for both the realization of hermeneutics' potential and the use of it to actually dismantle all that the previous century had sought to call into question. Schleiermacher's generalization of what was once only the preserve of the esoteric and the exegetical opened up, as we saw, an entire universe of human endeavor to such questioning. And though it was too obvious a rejoinder to this for Nietzsche to refer to the making of veils, we can agree that there is a difference to be noted between impetus and intent. Hermeneutics is not out to obscure meaning, quite the opposite. That said, there will always be moments wherein we feel we are farther from the truth of things than ever before. This calls our attention to the circular motion of interpretation and in all of its four models, as well as to the Hegelian sensibility concerning a dialectic which is assuredly present. I am going to travel afar before returning transformed, just as does the thesis confront its very opposite before being engaged in a new perception of self and other. We have also examined the problem posed by what is, in a sense, too much perspective. We understand that narrowness is without merit, but the vastness of an open expanse whereupon no frames can be discerned may also be unhelpful. Yes, universal truth bereft of interpretation truly is a pathless land, as Krishnamurti famously stated. But hermeneutics is not centered first around the truth of the world itself, as we also noted. It is not enough to simply acknowledge this ultimatum of cosmic truthfulness. In itself, the immediacy of what is, in its isness, presents the non-human equivalent of the once divine logos to itself, without equally recognizing that for we humans, the conception of truth on this level must remain as a functional benchmark, not even as an ideal. It should be taken in this manner not only because of the risk of abuse in claiming the truth, but as well that interpretation does itself never end. This is the wider ethical meaning called to mind by referring to it as perennial. Given all of this, what are the prospects of hermeneutics today? At first, the calls to heed meaning ahead of meaningfulness would seem to function negatively for its viability and its future. Meaning today oft gestures toward the credence given to resurrected credos, political agendas, personal opinions, even violent pseudo-ideologies. Meaning is taken far too literally, simplistically, narrowly, and without historical or yet cultural context. Meaning thus appears to itself lack experience, not only of the world but also of its own genealogy. When we ask, what does this mean, we tend to forget to also query the this. What is the this to which we are attaching meaning? This is not quite the same question as to ask something of its meaning alone. In concentrating upon meaning, we disregard the other meanings associated with positing thingness, event, and experience in the first place, and as well beyond these, the concept of thisness itself. We must ask before querying for meaning, what is the meaning of this? Why do I need to know what this means instead of or in lieu of some other meaningful experience? What does the focus on certain categories of thisness in itself mean? Why are some meanings assumed and others ignored? In order for hermeneutics to fully authenticate itself in the face of the social world's frames, it must think itself back to its basic problem, which includes the meaning of meaning, understood as apart from any patent referent or discursive slant. We tend to pose a question with the assumption that we know what the question itself means, why we have posed it, and why this question, for instance, that we already know and perhaps we have always known, at least as mature adults. We encourage our children to ask questions, but any passing survey of the scope of such questions, which are thus exhorted and even responded to, reveals an increasingly narrow range of possibilities for youthful minds to ponder. Hermeneutics has thus a radical ethical presence in the face of such stenochoric stanchions. It equally pursues the question along with any possible answer thereto. In this it differs, most markedly and materially, from the sensibility that asking how-to queries is a healthy habit for youth to be engaged with the backdrop that certain other kinds of questions either should not be asked or at the very least tend not to be. Worse still is the perception that the should not become the cannot. In a word, that it is not only taboo to ask this question, it is in fact not possible to do so. This is where, as Zizek has remarked about ideology in general, the very idea of truth succumbs to convenience, where the very arguments against ideology seem to concur with its presence and can be used as props for its presumption upon all that retains its meaning. As adults, we are waylaid by the utter ignorance of young children who must first understand how things work in order to function and develop at all. But it is to our mortal and future cost that we ourselves allow this how to substitute itself for the why of things when our children attain adolescence. An ongoing shame and sham alike, arguably the greatest scandal of modernity regarding education, the presentation of praxis as if it were the mere extension of excess, is not only unethical, it is anti-hermeneutical, if you will. Eventually, it convinces we adults that there is, after all, no why of things at all, and all is simply even banally how. We can understand this within the Weberian critique of Entzauberung, disenchantment, but I am going to suggest that this is itself too narrow scope to do it fuller justice. Yes, what is either correct or incorrect is the outcome of a rationalized existence, but further than this, what is present or what is absent tells me that purpose too, along with morality, has vanished. I am here, and then I am not here. As against this behaviorism, hermeneutics asks, in its ethical guise, what transpired in the interim? Those who take the means and methods of interpretation seriously will be able to respond to such a question, the kind we yet imagine the great questioner of Yeats might well ask of us. Hermeneutics presents the discursive object of what is more intimately a mode of being for Dasein. It eschews more curiosity as the distraction Heidegger notes. It does not tarry alongside, which is closest to us, but rather arcs away from this, so that we ourselves might follow its circuit. The text confronts me with its unknown meaning. The image objects to my very being through its own. Music disdains the odios all around and about me, and the world overtakes my puny selfhood and yet vaults it into the cosmos. But in order to access this unprecedented resource of otherness to self in any of the four general categories we've just outlined, we must authentically gauge, and with singular focus, with the question, not so much even of meaning, but of the meaningfulness of conceiving of meaning at all. For hermeneutics, this is the reason of being, and like language and use, it has made a mode of being in the world unique to the encounter between what is to come and what has been. The fulcrum, the crucible, the lighted space of the present provides each of us the means wherein meaning can be discerned and thence meaningfulness disclosed. That it must enact itself within the most stringent of bounds and strident of bonds, too, is authentic, for all such interpretation is at once radical to both the isness and thisness of how we know what we think we know, but as well revolutionary to all of the once concealed conceits of both self and age, now forever questioned, given purpose, and gifted to a more meaningful future. Thank you.